Bonjour, merci d'être là. On a un petit peu de retard, mais on ne doute pas que trépigner d'impatience à l'idée d'assister à cette conversation entre Hans Ulrich Obrist, directeur artistique des Sauber Galleries à Londres, et Francesco Vezzoli, l'artiste qui est actuellement exposé depuis quelques heures à peine à la villa, alors devrais-je dire à la villa Marlene ou à la villa Sauber. En tout cas, si vous voulez vous y rendre, c'est à la villa Sauber, au musée national de Monaco, pour un projet intitulé La Villa Marlene. Autour de Marlene d'Autriche, évidemment, je vous invite à découvrir tout au long de ce rendez-vous artistique que nous sommes heureux également à Monaco d'accueillir à la fois cette foire qui vient d'être inaugurée et une nuit blanche qui commence tout à l'heure et qui durera, comme le nom l'indique, jusqu'au petit matin, que je vous invite à découvrir également. Le programme se trouve à l'entrée. En quelques mots pour vous dire qu'on est heureux d'accueillir évidemment Hans Ulrich et Francesco ici, que cette invitation s'est faite un peu comme ça, on va dire, une sorte d'improvisation, puisque tout le monde de l'art contemporain est réuni aujourd'hui. Comment ne pas les réunir aujourd'hui et discuter ensemble d'un personnage qui a évidemment marqué l'histoire de Monaco, à tel point que, et bon, c'est une anecdote, mais l'espace dans lequel nous nous trouvons ici lui est consacré, puisque c'est donc Diaghilev, et ce fameux personnage dont Francesco et Hans Ulrich ont décidé d'aborder le sujet aujourd'hui, et je leur donne la parole pour qu'ils en disent davantage. Merci et bonne conversation.
Merci beaucoup pour cette introduction et évidemment tous nos remerciements aussi avec Lobo et à vous tous. On va faire cette conversation avec Francesco en anglais. Je voulais juste dire quelques préambles avant de commencer. Je tiens aussi à remercier Marie-Claude pour cette formidable collaboration sur l'exposition d'Uan Hansen, qui est une collaboration entre la Sauber et son musée. Et pour Francesco et pour moi, c'est un extraordinaire honneur et privilège de pouvoir parler dans la salle Diaghilev. On a beaucoup parlé de Diaghilev ensemble depuis beaucoup d'années, mais on n'a jamais parlé dans une salle Diaghilev. Je voulais aussi dire que c'est une journée très spéciale pour multiples raisons. C'est aussi l'anniversaire d'Alessandro Bava, donc joyeux anniversaire. And now we switch to English. So maybe before we talk about many things, because we want to talk today about, of course, Diaghilev, we want also to talk about Sylvia Bataille. We want to make a homage to our friend Zahra Lee. But before that, we should really talk about Marlene Dietrich and about your exhibition here in actually Monaco. Because one thing I think which is so interesting, Francesco, is that you told me when we spoke about it in London the other day that it's really an exhibition you made for here. It's not an exhibition which could happen anywhere else. So I just wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about the genesis of this project, because you mentioned, of course, the villa as a point of departure, this extraordinary late 19th century, context, and how did it all start?
Yes, I strongly believe that in the era of social media, the concept of traveling exhibition has kind of, I don't want to say vanished, but obviously because of social media, if an exhibition exists in one moment, in one place, it exists all over the world. And so I think it's more important than artists conceive exhibitions that are like haute couture, that are like made for the place where they will end up, and so that people feel compelled to come and visit the exhibition where it is. Almost like there is a performative aspect. When I was shown Villa Sauber, I was immediately fascinated by the history of it, by the fact that it belonged to an artist, by its architecture, by its location. And to me, that villa, for the color, for the shape, it seems the diva of a villa. And so I thought, instead of being a Villa Sauber, it could have been the imaginary place where Marlene Dietrich could have lived had she lived in Monte-Carlo. And I imagine that obsessed by her image, as any actress was, and she was more than the others, she commissioned portraits of herself to all the most relevant artists contemporary to her. from Bacon to Magritte to Matisse. So we created, we first, with the help of architect Bava, kind of restored to a certain extent the villa in a style that could suit the local habits, and then we filled it with fake masterpieces that are similar to the ones that are posted in some of the real villas of the coast.
And what prompted you to choose Marlene Dietrich? Because it's obviously fascinating that we spoke about it before, that Marlene Dietrich is maybe one of the last celebrities from Germany. It's very interesting that that sort of whole notion of celebrity doesn't really exist in Germany in the later part of the 20th century or 21st century. So she's kind of one of the last German celebrities. What prompted you to choose her and sort of bring her to Monaco?
Well, I think she made a movie called Monte-Carlo, but that's not the kind of things that interest me. That's just, it would be silly to say that. I was always fascinated by Dietrich as an actress, but for me the real turning point was when I discovered her, I wouldn't call it political commitment, but political standing. And not only she left Germany when she was courted by Goering, she refused the courtship, she refused the German Nazi government to use her as an icon. She left, she went to work in America, and not only that, she worked very committedly to support the American and the European troops during the war. And so this for me created in my imagination the dichotomy that I always like about divas. Whenever they ask me, why do you do these embroideries of divas crying? And I say, because that's the other side of a public identity. The diva, when she's not on the screen, when she's not under the big lights, when she's not being filmed, she has a private, painful identity. And Marlene had a private identity, and she was a woman on the forefront. She was there to support the soldier, and there are many testimonies that confirm that even if it was like a dangerous war zone, she would say, no, let's go, let's support the soldier. She would risk her own life for this. So in this sense, this is not the Blue Angel, this is not Lola, this is not the actress that plays in the movie The Song of Songs, this is not even the Witch in Touch of Evil by Orson Welles. This is a very practical woman. And so the idea that there were two Marlene, as there always is with the greatest diva, fascinated me most. I'll say two last things. 3 days ago I spoke with someone whose mother knew Marlene, and she said she was a very practical woman. 10 years ago there was an auction at Sotheby's, and they were auctioning all her properties from her house, and there was the kitchen telephone. And for me, that was an artwork in itself. The kitchen telephone was a very plain telephone, white, a wall telephone, but the wire was 10 meters long. And the caption on the Sotheby's catalog specified that the wire was 10 meters long because Marlene would cook every meal for herself and for all her guests, but she wanted to be on the phone at the same time. For me, that was an artwork, and it told us about all that she was, a cook.
This is so great. And obviously what you mentioned is political courage. I, in London, had long conversations a few years ago with Louise Reino, who was more than 100 years old at that time, and she obviously won early Academy Awards against Greta Garbo and this very legendary actress. And she always, compared kind of political courage, it said to refuse, as you said earlier today, to refuse Goering, to refuse the approaches the Nazis made to her, and to stand firm, to really take risks, not to take immense risks. In this sense, quite similar to the risk actresses or actors took, like Louise Reino in the United States, when all of a sudden in the 50s, the McCarthy year, it became very dangerous for actors and actresses to be politicized. So this idea of immense courage, as Jean Rouge would call it. But another thing which I was interested in is when I was listening to a conversation you gave to Judith Benamou yesterday in your show, which she put online this morning, and you say something very interesting about the older Marlene Dietrich and the idea that the roles she accepted and the roles she didn't accept, and the kind of choice of roles, like with Orson Welles, etc. And that reminded me actually of another encounter with an actress I had when I spoke to Jean Moreau a couple of years ago, and Jean told me that it's really the most important thing for an actress is not the movies he or she decides to do, but is the movie refuses, to do in terms of the filmography. So I wanted to ask you to tell us more about that and about the older Marlene and this amazing film, and also your obsession for A Touch of Evil.
Well, I think, I don't want to exaggerate, but I think the more she ages, the least movies she accepts to do, and I think she only did very, very few towards the 50s and the 60s. One is the process of Nuremberg, which she accepted, of course, because of her political beliefs, so she did that as a political gesture, which is very interesting. And then she accepted two movies that went straight down in film history. One is Touch of Evil by Orson Welles, where she plays the evil clairvoyant, and the other one is Witness for the Prosecution by Billy Wilder. So I think, I am pretty sure that during the time she accepted to do those three movies, she must have refused many other bad movies, but that's why she managed to remain in history, because she didn't sell, like your friend Louis Reiner said, or like Jean Moreau said, is the movies you say no to. But in that sense, Jean Moreau, who has worked with me as well, and I've met, these women had, I would say, a political integrity that is actually surprisingly way superior to the politicians that sometimes rule our countries.
And another thing I thought was interesting is how you actually discovered somehow your interest in Marlene Dietrich, because you said that it had to do with Maximilian Schell and this very famous German documentary, and you mentioned the kind of idea of the voice, and it actually reminded me, because the other day I saw this film on Peggy Guggenheim, very interesting new documentary which came out on the life of Peggy Guggenheim. And I was completely spellbound. And it had a lot to do with the voice, because they found an original document which long forgotten and people thought it was lost, where basically Peggy Guggenheim told her life to her biographer. And this became somehow the umbilical cord. And I saw an earlier cut, I saw an earlier version of the film before they had found this document, and it was just like any other documentary. And then they found this document, and it's this umbilical cord of the voice. It's only an audio recording, so you don't have the image, but it's the voice. And it somehow reminded me of your Maximilian Schell story. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, speaking of the movies you accept to do and the ones that you refuse to do, Marlene accepted to be in a documentary kind of about her life, but she accepted Marlene way. She said, you can film just until the door of my bedroom, so you will only hear my voice and you will not see my face. And but it's still the most powerful documentary about Marlene that we have, not only because it was made by a creative person, but because of course Marlene had confidence with Maximilian Schell, so a lot comes out. And just the voice alone, in the case of Marlene, like in the case of Peggy Guggenheim, can tell much more or just as much as an image. And in this moment in history that we live, where voice has been kind of excluded by private communication. I don't know if you noticed that, but now we only communicate via WhatsApp or via email, and voice is kind of lost as an element that betrays too many human feelings. So if you see it in a documentary, it's powerful, because even just the voice can tell a lot about your life. In this documentary, while Maximilian Schell is editing the images about Marlene, let's say a funny, fairly old woman appears on the screen, and of course for the film audience this woman means nothing, they don't recognize her, but for people who have a little awareness of history of art, they realize this woman is Annie Albers. So Maximilian Schell had two obsessions, Marlene Dietrich and Annie Albers. And then I thought it was interesting how the two most politically courageous and creatively courageous women in German history had only at that moment 1 degree of separation.
And how did you then bring in Annie Albers? Because that's obviously a very unexpected thing to suddenly have Annie next to Marlene. How did that happen? I mean, you worked with Albers before.
Yes, no, and then I started imagining that which of course never happened, that Annie and Marlene became friends and made movies together and things like that, which is a bit, goes back to the exhibition that I did here. But there are some actual facts that I avoided in my exhibition. So Marlene was very likely the lover of Max Ernst, was very likely in a friendship with Giacometti, hoping that Giacometti would have done a portrait of her. So, you know, there is always this very interesting link between the obsession with your own icon that at some point needs the validation of an artist. And that is a dynamic that I've experienced a lot in my life because I work with a lot of actresses, so I know how that mechanism works. And there are these incredible images of Marlene unveiling the exhibition for Giacometti, and there are anecdotes of Marlene going to Giacometti's studio and being upset because maybe she expected him to do right away a portrait of her, which for Giacometti was of course not an option. So it's again a struggle of vanities.
And can you talk a little bit more about the portraits in the show? Because you mentioned before, there is Bacon, there is Magritte, there is Modigliani, there is the Chirico, there is also in a completely different way Matisse enters. And it would be great to hear more about the portraits, because obviously also this whole idea of the portrait, I suppose, changes in the digital age, where we have so many more portraits.
Yes, well, then we were very lucky, and like the curator of the exhibition was so smart, he found actually, for me, the greatest piece in the show, which is a real Matisse drawing of a young girl that actually looks like a young Marlene. So the entire exhibition is a bit like an experience between fiction and reality, because the fake paintings look real, and the real painting, the real drawing of Matisse could seem like a fake. On top of these Matisse, Bacon, Magritte paintings, there is, which are fictional portraits of Marlene, as if Marlene commissioned them to the artist. There is actually a recreation of a real portrait of Marlene, because in 1930, when for the first movie that Marlene decided to do in Hollywood, the entire narrative of the movie revolves around the fact that Marlene falls in love with a sculpture, and this sculpture makes a sculpture of her, and we rebuilt the same sculpture. And so in some film history movies, in some film history books, it's quoted as the first case in Hollywood when a true artist is asked to make a sculpture of a character in a movie. Funnily enough, we discovered that the sculpture we made, that sculpture was Salvatore Scarpitta, who was then the father of arte povera master Salvatore Scarpitta Jr. And so there is a whole range of fake, real and fictional reflection of her own Dorian Gray-esque Marlene obsession with herself.
The Salvatore Scarpitta story is incredible, because when I was a student, I came for the first time to Italy, I met Salvatore Scarpitta, and he was with Leo Castelli.
Yes.
He's the only artist who kind of was with Leo Castelli and who wasn't famous, which was kind of interesting. And he had this strange parallel reality, because he didn't really want to talk about the art when I met him, but he talked about these car racings, and he had these very strange logos of Scarpitta. It was kind of a very strange. So there are many parallel realities to Salvatore Scarpitta. And there is also him as a figurative sculptor, as we find out here in your show.
Well, yeah, it's a bit of a story like Robert Ryman. Robert Ryman made only like monochrome, simplifying Robert Ryman, and his son makes sculptures that are shaped like blossoming roses. And Salvatore Scarpitta's father made the Art Deco sculpture, and Salvatore Scarpitta's son became one of the pioneers of arte povera. So that is an interesting dynamic as well, that we could link to the relationship that Marlene Dietrich had with her own daughter. Way more complicated than the one between Scarpitta father and Scarpitta son.
Now, talking about this exhibition and talking about your relationship to this place here, this specific place here, we need, of course, to talk about Diaghilev, and we are here in the Diaghilev space. The spirit of Diaghilev is, of course, always present in Monaco, but it's always present as well in your work, and it's always been present in my activity as well. I kind of always think I became a curator somehow because of Diaghilev. Particularly inspiring, of course, for me was this idea that he actually started out in Russia by doing an art magazine and also by doing exhibitions of portraiture. This is a very interesting link that the early Diaghilev, actually, like you here in Monaco, did exhibition of portraiture, which he then, another link, toured around the world. It was a period when we still believed in touring show. It was before this idea that it became apparent that exhibitions have to have a local necessity, and he wanted to desperately tour these Russian portraiture exhibitions all over the world. And then all of a sudden realized the limits of this kind of medium of an exhibition of painting, and started to kind of extend or expand. I mean, he, of course, at that time didn't call it curating, but expand his sort of curatorial endeavor into this idea of what became the Ballet Russe, where he, instead of space, would somehow curate time. And you have worked a lot on Diaghilev. It's almost the topic of each of our conversations ever since we met for the first time. So I wanted to ask you here in Monaco, in the Espace Diaghilev, to tell us a little bit about your relationship to Diaghilev, when you discovered him first, how it was an inspiration, and of course also all your work you've done about Diaghilev, for example in Moscow.
Well, it's I get often asked not just about Diaghilev, but I get often asked why I like a certain actress, why I like a certain director. I like many things. Of course, I choose some specific one because I think they are more relevant to the cultural moment we inhabit. I was reading the other night something about commemorating Umberto Eco and the concept of opera aperta. I think in a moment that is very influenced, I will not say by the market, but I will in general say that the art world is influenced by a certain rigidity. I mean, there is having become such a huge system, there are more rules, the museums are bigger and they move slower, etc., etc. I'm endlessly fascinated by figures that have created opera aperta, by artists whose work is not just only one thing or one perspective, but whose work is their own life. And I think definitely we could say that about Diaghilev. Because in the end, yes, it goes down to the object that you produce or to the books that you write, but to me it goes more down to the role that you play within the cultural debate. So in that sense, it was very precise that you brought up the fact that Diaghilev started as a curator. I have my book completely by chance open here, exactly on the page, about the fact that the success of the exhibition he made in Russia in 1905 led him and gave him the possibility to make the same exhibition of Russian painters in Paris. So he was exactly what today we would call a curator. But how can you separate that from the fact that after wanting to bring Russian painters to visibility in Paris, he wanted to bring Russian culture to visibility in Paris and all over the world throughout the ballet? I think what moves me in Diaghilev is the ambition of bringing worldwide the culture of his own country. And we should read this not as a nationalistic thing. I like to read this as an act of sincerity, as an act of cultural contribution. Of course, we live in a globalized world, but maybe sometimes what we can give to the audience is a slice of our roots, if we want the audience to be truly interested. Because if we try to give to the audience what they already know, we are not going to be very interesting. And I think Diaghilev was just bringing to the world a tradition in the same way Maria Callas was bringing around the world bel canto, and why she married an Italian man, and or then she fell in love for a Greek man. These great identities, they want to send in the world their history of their own heart. I don't want to sound melodramatic, but this is what I think, and so I find in Diaghilev, his life, his choreography, a universe of truth.
And that's kind of leads us to many other
television, making the most amazing things. So I've decided to work with historians, because I'm not a historian, and try to reconnect history and this history of creativity, and exhibit these products as not as artworks, just as things that Italians should see again, and maybe the world should see for the first time, and understand their relevance. And I think it's only true by relating with enthusiasm with your own roots that you can find new strength to create the new. So I'm definitely against amnesia.
And that of course manifests itself also in your work, where you actually revisit even much older work than Italian television, where you actually visit classical marble heads and other, you know, Roman sculptures, and in some way, if you talk about Hobsbawm, that always reminded me of Panofsky's sentence when he says, you know, we often invent the future with fragments from the past. So again, it's not about nostalgia, but it's using the past as a kind of a toolbox. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about this fascination with classical Rome and how it started, and if it's something which you continue.
Yes, well, it started in high school because I was forced to study ancient Greek and ancient Latin as a language, and their art history. But it kind of, after 20 years in the art world, and having lived in London and New York and Los Angeles, and actually like a committed student, I would say, been to visit or the exhibition about, you know, I mean, great shows from Bruce Nauman to Boys to everything, you know. I felt that in order, each time I feel lost, I look at history, you know, I look at my own history, I look at the history of my own country to gain strength. And at that point I decided that to not to just do that with my brain, but to do that with my works could have made sense. So I started literally buying from auctions these ancient pieces, which are obviously not expensive at all. They are much less expensive than an edition of a contemporary artist, and reworking with them or reinstalling or playing with them. And I'm just, and everybody asks me, oh, they're so contemporary or they're so modern. And that I don't necessarily like, because it's like when somebody sees an old movie, it's such a cliche to say, oh, but it stands up with its time, you know, it's still modern. I'm not interested in modernity, I'm interested in life. So that's why I paint my Roman sculpture, because they don't have to look modern. They can look old, but they must look alive. I hope this makes sense.
And of course it leads us also to another exhibition which happens actually parallel to the show here in Monaco, and still, I think, until later this year, visible at the museum in Bolzano, actually until the 6th of November 2016, where, similarly to Diaghilev, you actually act as a curator, as an artist curator. Can you tell us a little bit about the exhibition and how you there, of course, again, you know, revisit fragments from the past, some very old fragments, but also some from the more recent history. I thought it's kind of interesting also because it's not only the past we forget. I mean, Walter Benjamin pointed out that maybe the biggest amnesia happens with the just past, with things which have, you know, been 20, 30 years ago. And in the exhibition in Bolzano, you have certain amazing artists like Carla Accardi or Mario Schifano who enter more this category of just past. You know?
Yes, I deliberately wanted to put Schifano, and basically what I did is that on the top floor there is a selection of my archaeological sculpture, which is okay, it's like I'm happy about it, and the director of museum, she made a great gift by installing them fantastically. But I think probably the most interesting part is where I entirely reinstalled the collection of museum by reframing it. So every piece from the collection is rehand with a historical frame ranging from 16th to 18th to 19th century. And not only I selected artists exactly like Hans Ulrich brought up, like Schifano, whatever, that are the victims of recent amnesia, but I even went further. I reinstalled some artists of the local tradition. And this seemed to generate a big amount of surprise among the visitors. And I said, well, what's to be feared about where we come from or the mistakes we have made? I mean, this is, you know, when you learn, when you make gender studies, the more you try to hide things, the more a mess you make. The more you try to deal with the past, the better of a human being you become. So, as precisely as you said, this recent amnesia is the most dangerous one because we tend to wipe away art that is associated to historical moments we want to forget, because these historical moments are politically charged with mistakes that we have made, with positions we may have taken that we may want to forget. My country is still dealing with that. I mean, I think Mario Sironi is a great artist, but it's impossible to see a decent exhibition of Mario Sironi because you will only be able to see a Mario Sironi retrospective organized by some politically reactionary curators. Instead, you know, we all need to learn a way to deal with our past. And this has a meaning in many different senses. Our recent past, our mistakes of the past, only if we deal with that, which is the same thing that happens in a human relationship, in a sexual relationship, then you can start again and make it work.
Of course, if you think about this work, you know, this non-nostalgic work, is the past, it also leads to something you once said in an interview that in a way you read biographies, you like history, you watch documentaries, but you can't read science fiction, and also you don't read much fiction. So I wanted to hear a little bit about that.
Yes, I'll tell you an anecdote. When I was like 5 or 4 years old, my mother would show me movies on television, and my first question, if it was a comedy, would be like, why are they laughing? It's like, and she said, why? She would say, why are you asking me this? I said, like, is this movie before the Second World War or is it after? She would say, it's before. And I would ask, how can they laugh? Because then there's going to be the war. So I am obsessively attached to truth and history, and I regret it, but I have like a real block towards science fiction, because whenever I see something that is disconnected to history, it kind of it lacks fascination for me. But it's of course a failure. I mean, it's not a failure, but it's a deficit I have. But that's the way I am.
But still, if we talk about, you know, the future, there are obviously so many unrealized projects, you know, of yours. We could talk about which are projects for the future. We already talked about one quite detailed, this very exciting project about the Italian television. But then there is also a very sadly unrealized project, which hopefully still can happen, which is your unrealized project with Zaha Hadid. We both were very close friends with Zaha. And I wanted to kind of ask you to somehow also in memory of Zaha to tell us a little bit about this project on which you've been working with her basically until the very moment of that.
Well, yes, it links to our conversation because it was my attempt to contextualize Zaha's work within Niemeyer's work. So again, it was about history, and I was offered by the Brazilian government the opportunity to work in the Oca Pavilion in São Paulo, which is one of the earliest examples of the great architecture of Niemeyer, and I proposed Zaha to do something within that space, and unfortunately Zaha is no longer with us, but that would have been another great dialogue between history and the future, because I mean, I don't want to push it too far, but certainly Zaha and Niemeyer, they both share, in the most obvious way, the futuristic label of architecture. You think of Sant'Elia, you think of the futurist when you see the shapes of Zaha's buildings. And the same is for when you see Niemeyer. You really see that the radical approach they had to architecture was really linked to creating like a metropolis, basically. So in that sense, it would have been another great opportunity to have a very modern, a very present person as Zaha was, because Zaha was not modern, Zaha was present. When she was in a room, you felt Zaha was there, to take her back to the roots of some of her inspiration. Fortunately, it didn't happen, but it's, I mean, I keep in my heart the happiness that at least we started something like that.
Of course, she and Niemeyer also had in common this obsession for drawing, because whenever I would visit Niemeyer, he would draw obsessively, and even when he was 103, at the very end, when I saw him, he stopped drawing in pencil, but he drew in the air, which was somehow more beautiful. Of course, with Zaha, much less known than that, because she never really exhibited that throughout her life. She always had this very intense drawing activity, not at all with the computer, but kind of almost calligraphic, calligraphic kind of in drawings. But when we spoke in London about Zaha, you told me about the feeling you have that she's somehow the Maria Callas of architecture in terms of this dedication. Can you talk a little bit about that, about Zaha and Callas?
Yes, well, I think like some great women have to fight hard to emerge and to make their creative identity emerge in the world, and they sacrifice their entire life to this identity and to their creativity, and they succeed. They find a place in history, but they sacrifice maybe some aspect of their life. But I think they do it happily, and in this sense, I feel that Zaha now has a place in history as much as Maria Callas does, and I don't. I mean, I feel sadness for her absence, but I think, of course, I would have liked to see more buildings of her. But I think she completed her 3 acts. She was about to start a new opera, but some people died before the end of the 3rd act. Some people managed to arrive at the end of the 3rd act, and I think Zaha did. So now the world is full of in many different types of part of the world, there is a sign of Zaha's existence. That is important.
But one thing which is really interesting is that shortly, a few weeks before her death, she actually did something she always refused to do. She had been asked many, many times, which is, the desert island thing on BBC, where basically famous practitioners in art and cinema and so on, and theatre, pop industry and so on, would be asked to tell their favorite records and then go to BBC and explain why. And it's actually very interesting. You can listen to that online, and her choices are extremely mainstream. It goes from Adele to Drake and so on. And so I was kind of wondering, because we were listening to that the other day, that reminded me also of something Dan Graham once told me, is that we can really never understand an artist unless we know what kind of music he or she is listening to. So I was kind of wondering, what would be your kind of desert island choice of music?
It's very easy. In this room there is a person that helps me loading my iPod, and he says I have the most melancholic selection of music a human being can have. So if somebody, I never show my music selection because if people get scared. It's the least sexy, like it's beyond Adele, beyond it's just like sad songs. But I do it unconsciously, you just Shazam something that resonates for your emotion, and there you go. So, but Dan Graham is right. You never realize what the true artist feels until you look into his iPod. That's why people can see my dirty messages, but I don't want them to see my song selection.
A very few last questions. So we spoke about, you know, some of your unrealized projects, the one with Zaha, and the one which is in, you know, somehow on the way to be realized, which is the Italian television project. I was wondering if you have kind of any unrealized projects which have been too big to be realized, or if you have dreams or utopias.
I'll borrow, and maybe we can end on this, since I've been speaking only about things I've been doing. Let's speak about one that I haven't done. My mentor in New York was a great writer called Herbert Musham. And Herbert, before he died, was about to be appointed architectural curator at the Guggenheim, which was a kind of position that they never had. And he always said to me that the first exhibition he wanted to suggest to them would have been to find all the existing Antinos sculptures in the world and install all of them inside the Guggenheim. And this was more than 15 years ago. And I think, well, yes, if one day I will be powerful enough to force the Guggenheim to fill the whole space with 2,000 Antino sculptures from all over the world, this would be an interesting statement about how the past and the future are exactly the same thing, because what Adrian did for Antinos was a sort of archaic form of Instagram.
Beautiful. I do have, however, another last question, because we completely forgot to talk about NIO, which is a kind of a new movement, you can say, and it's you haven't spoken in public about it before, but it's a very recent intuition that you proclaimed or told me about a feeling of a new Italian optimism. So new Italian optimism, NIO. I told Ren Koolhaas the story a few days ago, and he actually said maybe we can just skip the new, it's maybe just IO, it's maybe just Italian optimism. So can you tell us about NIO or IO, about this new Italian, why is this feeling, this feeling which we all can feel? You know, I was the other day in Milano for Mian, and also, of course, for the Salon Mobile, you know, looking at lots of shows, and there is a very different spirit than a few years ago. There is something very positive, but you're the first one to somehow phrase it into a movement.
Well, Rem was making irony about my ego by saying that I should call the movement simply EO, but that's fine. I can take it from a man who has a bigger ego than anyone else. Well, yes, I'm optimistic. I feel that basically we live in a, there are places in the world or places in the brain that are very iconoclastic, and moments in history that are very iconoclastic. I think because of social media, we live in a moment of iconomadness. You know, we need icon, we need them fresh, we need them new, we need location. So I think in this sense, and now I want to say something politically very incorrect, in order to take a great selfie, you need a great background. So we have Capri, we have Positano, we have Sicily, we have Portofino, we have Milano, we have Rome, we have Colosseo. We are a great touristic supermarket, and we are there ready to be photographed as a background. And because of this, everybody should just come to Italy and take their own picture and make our economy stronger.
That could not be a better conclusion. Francesco, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here.
Le pavillon Bozio nous avons accueillis sur cet espace de conversation et également un espace de repos tout au long de la foire et de performance qui s'appelle le département des archives de la critique d'art, qui pouvait forcément ne pas mieux se trouver que de vous accueillir ici. Et un dernier mot pour dire qu'à 18h30 à la Villa Sauber, Francesco Vezzoli réalisera une performance dans le cadre du programme Nuit Blanche. Et également, puisque Hans Ulrich et Francesco en parlaient tout à l'heure, davantage concernant ce qu'il y avait dans dans son iPod quelques lectures qui seront organisées cet été à la Villa Sauber et à la Villa Paloma, d'après des sélections d'ouvrages faits par Hans Ulrich Obrist, Francesco Vezzoli, Douglas Coupland, Jean-Pascal Flavien et Christodoulos Panayiotou. Et il me semble que dans la sélection que Francesco Vezzoli mentionnait tout à l'heure, se trouvent non pas des ouvrages, mais des chansons, des musiques, enfin des paroles de chansons. Voilà. Donc rendez-vous est donné, à bientôt, merci pour tout, merci Hans Ulrich, merci Francesco.